Okay, hello. So first of all, announcements. Number one is that I just not long ago sent out an email about the final assignment. I don't know if everyone has seen that yet, but in case you haven't, uh, I'm not making it optional, but I am saying that um, on the one hand, if you can get it in by the due date, or at least like a day or two after that, um, I'm going to tell the TAs to grade it more charitably than usual, and I'm also changing the minimum page length from 6 to 4. So you could write a paper. It doesn't have to be that great. It doesn't have to be very long. Um, if you feel that you can't do that, then I'll be happy to give you an incomplete. Um, so, and then you can write your paper sometime over the summer. Other questions about that? Okay, I guess not. The other announcement I have is that after the end of lecture today, my daughter Margaret has uh, wants to offer a short Q&A session if anyone has questions to ask her.
Wait, I thought you weren't going to do it at the end. You were going to do it at a different time. I was just going to ask if they wanted to do it at the end.
Oh, you mean you want them to tune in for a question and answer session some other time?
Yeah. Or at the end, I guess. Okay, guys, at the end if you want to do that.
Yeah, I mean, anyway, this is optional, but I don't know what kind of questions you might want to ask her. Probably.
Including asking questions to my dad, because if you were always like, hey, why does he always wear that weird shirt?
Yeah, like
Ask him.
if you're like, why does he always wear that weird shirt? You could ask me, but better, you could ask her. All right. Anyway, sorry. So now back to Hume. So right. So I am going to try to. Which other philosophers has she drawn? Yeah, you can ask her that as well. She hasn't drawn very many philosophers, actually. I tried to get her to draw Coleridge and some other philosophers last year, but she didn't, or not last year. Whenever that was. It seems like years ago, but it was like fall quarter. No, winter. I don't know. Anyway, um, sorry. So, yeah, I do want to go over some of the stuff about justice that I didn't get to at the end last time. Um, um, so remember what I was saying is, well, two things. Remember, number one, that for Hume, justice means the virtue basically of respecting other people's property. I mean, that is, it includes certain, I guess, related matters about contracts and so forth. But it's basically about respecting other people's uh, contractual and property rights. Um, and his claim is that that virtue we approve of solely because of its social utility. The only basis for for our praising this virtue of justice is that we um, believe that having a character like that is socially useful, meaning it's useful to the society of the person who has it. So, um, and of course, as usual, it will be more useful if they're in an important position, right? Like if they're a judge or something, a policeman. Uh, it will be more useful if they have that virtue of respecting other people's rights and property. Uh, but um, but we abstract from that and we just ask: is this a useful type of character to have in our society? Period. So so how does he try to prove this? I mean, it's not, of course, an easy thing to prove that there's no other basis or something like that. He takes it for granted that we'll agree. Well, no, as I said last time, he doesn't really take it for granted. He does go through a little argument to convince you that you should think, that everyone should think that something like our system of property is socially useful, and therefore respecting it is socially useful. Um, but for the most part, he takes it for granted that we'll agree that this is socially useful. But the question is how to show that it's only because it's socially useful that we approve of it. So he basically has two lines of argument. Um, One is that he gives a whole bunch of examples of situations where some of the things that make this virtue socially useful don't apply. And then says, and look, you don't consider justice to be a virtue in that situation, do you? So I mean, it's asking us to decide from our vantage point in our society, which hopefully doesn't fall under any of these cases, um, although that's not always so clear. But anyway, from our vantage point in our society, we're supposed to be deciding about this person in this other pretty weird situation, whether we approve, whether we want to praise them for justice or not. So I mentioned one of these examples briefly at the end last time, right? This is the example of where the society is living in such plenty, it's almost impossible to imagine this. It's not just that there's enough for everyone. I mean, Hume says even for us, there's actually enough for everyone, right? It's just there's so much, and you don't have to do anything to get it. So, like, whatever you want is like right there as soon as you want it, basically. So Hume says, like, in that situation, ask yourself whether we would approve of someone who's like, well, no, I'm not taking that fruit because it's your property. And he at least, and then, I mean, you realize that if he took that fruit that he's calling my property, I would just take another one immediately, right? Like there wouldn't even be a delay. It's just like as soon as he took it out of my hand, if I still want a fruit, there would be another fruit, basically. So he's saying in that situation, um, we wouldn't approve of that. We wouldn't consider that to be a virtue. Um, Another situation he mentions is a society where everyone is maximally benevolent, right? So everyone cares about everyone else just exactly as much as they care about themselves. So he says, again, in that situation, property would not be useful because, um, like, I know you won't take anything unless you need it more than I do. And if you need it more than I do, since I'm actually also maximally benevolent, I'm like happy to let you take it. Right? So there again, there's no point in property, and therefore there's no virtue in respecting property. Now, I guess one thing to point out about that example is that that kind of ignores the issue of people, whether people actually know what's best for them. Right? I mean, imagine a society where I want what's best for you as much as I want what's best for me. but I might still think I know better than you do what's best for you, right? So, like, you might say, well, what I really need is more alcohol, right? Or more philosophy books or something like that. And I might say, yeah, I might say what my other daughter, Alana, just said, you do not need more philosophy books.
You have like a bajillion of them.
Yes, this is just an example, Alana. but thank you for illustrating it, right? So you can imagine I'm living in this maximally benevolent society, and I'm like, I want more philosophy books. And you look at me and you're like, no, philosophy books are making you miserable. I'm going to take them away from you. So there actually still is a basis for conflict in this society, even though everyone wants what's best for everyone else. And I guess, one thing that this highlights is that what sometimes called procedural justice is like Hume is not paying attention to that at all, at least here, right? Which would mean that, like, it doesn't matter whether you have my best interests at heart or not. You can't take my property without proving to someone that what you're doing is my best interest, to some authority. Um, so, um, uh, he's not taking that into account, that might be part of the virtue we call justice, I guess. Maybe he just would think of that as a different virtue. I'm not sure. Okay, another example he gives, and this is maybe one of his strongest cases, in part because it's the only one that he offers an actual example of, which is the example of or at least something like an example of, which is the example of society where there just isn't enough of anything. So as he puts it, like, even with the most frugal use of the resources we have and so forth, most people are going to die. And the ones who are left are not going to have it easy either. So Hume says in that situation also there would be no point to property, and therefore we don't consider respect or we wouldn't consider respect for property to be a virtue in that situation. And the example he gives is a shipwreck. Right? So the ship has fallen apart, everyone's in the water, everyone's trying to find something to hold on to keep themselves afloat. Like, there aren't enough things, a lot of people are going to drown, and then we imagine someone finding like a suitcase floating and saying, oh, checking the label to make sure it's theirs before they hold on to it. And he's saying that wouldn't be a virtue, right? Like, in that situation, property is, all property rules are called off because they're no longer socially useful. Um, and there's a few more examples. I think I'm not going to talk about all of them, but one that is definitely worth talking about is the example of the really weak people. So he describes this. He says, suppose intermingled among human beings were this kind of rational being that is not strong enough either in body or in mind to offer us any resistance or to make us feel any resentment, to make us feel their resentment at even the highest provocation. And then he says, we would recognize the virtue of being benevolent to those really weak beings, but not of being just to them. So this is kind of worrying. It seems like it worries him too, at least if I read this correctly, because he says that when Europeans came to the New World and they perceived themselves as being so much more powerful than the natives, they imagined, incorrectly, but they imagined themselves to be in this situation. And that's why they threw off all restraint of justice in their dealings with the natives. So uh, I think it's clear that Hume is not approving of that, or anyway, he's not praising it. That is, he doesn't consider it praiseworthy. That is, he doesn't consider it virtuous what they did. Um, but it's kind of understandable or can be explained on his principles why they did that anyway, even though they shouldn't have. So, I mean, first of all, whether that's the real explanation or not, I don't know. Um, Second of all, it raises some question. We'll get back to questions like this at the end, but I don't know if I'll get back to this one specifically because Hume doesn't raise it, or at least doesn't explicitly raise it. Isn't it dangerous to even talk about exceptions like that? Right? Why give this example, Hume? You know, you know perfectly well that people are going to make that same mistake again. Now, I mean, how do we know it is a mistake? I think the very weak people or beings that he's imagining, when you say they're not strong enough in body or mind to offer any resistance, I think you have to imagine, and actually he gives this example, you have to imagine them as being like non-human animals, right? Like cats, let's say. So cats are not strong enough in body or mind, meaning uh, like you couldn't sign a treaty with cats. You couldn't like make a contract with them. They couldn't represent themselves in court. Uh, right? Like a being that could do any of those things, even not very well, doesn't fit under this definition. And as you say, but wait, are cats rational? Well, so here Hume leaves it kind of a question, but elsewhere he says, yeah, non human animals are less rational than we are, or something, but it's a continuum. It's not a difference in kind. So, if you think of that example, I think you can see that, yeah, we think it's important to be benevolent to cats, right? To treat them humanely. There might even be some things that you could call justice that we think are important to cats, are virtuous characteristics in your intercourse with cats, right? Like maybe you shouldn't tease the cat, like raise its expectations and then thwart them, or, abandon it when it's come to trust you, or something like that. But although you might call those justice, they're not what Hume is calling justice, right? So justice, strictly speaking, means, is it a virtue to respect the cat's property? And I think it's at least plausible to say, well, it's nice, maybe, it's benevolent, but it's not justice. The cat doesn't really have property. To get the cat to have property, we'd have to assign a guardian to it, like a human, to take care of its property. And that's we don't have a duty of justice to do that, although maybe it would be nice. So, I mean, at least it's still not 100% clear, is it really true? Maybe wild animals, we should treat them as having nature as their property. I don't know, but anyway, it's not completely ridiculous, and yet it is worrying, as I said, that example. Okay, so those are all the examples I'm going to talk about. There's a couple other ones, but other questions about those? Okay. Um, all right, and the other argument he makes is also interesting, but I'm just going to mention it briefly, which is that the rules of property are very complicated. They're different in different places at different times, and um, there doesn't seem to be any basis in the object that we're talking about for these rules, right? So, like, is his example, here's a tree that full of fruit that I'm perfectly permitted to take and eat, and that's virtuous. And here's another tree 10 feet away, same species, same kind of fruit. But if I take from that tree, it's a crime and it's an injustice. Well, like, they look the same, right? So he says, you know, if you didn't know about the social utility of this system, it would look like superstition. By superstition, he means basically religion, right? I mean, like, he leads you to believe that he's thinking of Catholicism specifically, I think. But he does this in a lot of places, and yet I think it's pretty clear that he thinks all religions are superstitions. So I mean, any religion with any kind of ritual rules or whatever would, at least would be the kind of thing he's comparing it to here. And he says, of course, all enlightened people know that's ridiculous. So why shouldn't we think that about property? And the answer is the only difference is that property is socially useful. Something a little weird about this argument, but I mean, having to do, I guess, with the question of like, are we imagining a kind of mythical time before superstition arose when everyone was enlightened, the way Hume is? And that's when our opinions about virtue, our natural opinions, originated. And then in between, there were these superstitions. But now that they're gone, we're enlightened again. We're kind of gone in some places. We're enlightened again. Um, uh, that doesn't seem like good history. Uh, you don't see any trace of that in Hume's History of England, for example. So it seems like when we're asking what the natural origin of morals is, or something like that, it's more of an abstraction that's going on. But anyway, so that's how that argument works. Um, okay, that's everything I'm going to say about justice that's left over from last time. Are there questions about that? Okay, so in that case, I'm going to erase justice. Oops. Um, and go on to section 5. So the problem of section 5 is why does social utility please? Right? In other words, in having in the first 4 sections explained that, oh, determines who is weak in the dynamic previously described, the dominant party or a third party? Well, it's like, if there's any question about that, then it's not the situation described, right? In other words, if I say you guys are too weak to offer any resentment, blah, 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 and you say, no, we're not too weak, then you just showed that I was wrong. Because you did make me feel your resentment, at least a little bit, right? That's why I was saying you have to imagine beings that can't speak up for themselves. Um, um, and I mean, of course, not just because they can't make the noises we do when we talk, but because they can't think the way we do, right? Um, so they can't uh, think, hey, who says I'm the weaker one? remember, he says they have to be weaker in body and mind. That, I mean, I'm not sure he wants to be that strict. But does this mean, I mean, because like say elephants are not weaker than us in body, does that mean that they're not a case like this? I'm not sure what, but in any case, the mind criterion is actually the more important one. I mean, no matter how weak they are embodied, I'm sure they could find a way to hurt you if they could think about it, at least a little bit. Does that answer the question? Okay. I mean, again, like, and again, Hume's question at this point is not like, okay, you find yourself in this situation, what should you do? That's a question of recommending a certain virtue or whatever, and he's not going to take that up until section 9 at the end. But his question is just like, what would we approve of or not approve of in this situation? And I think, like, what would we consider praiseworthy or blameworthy if we imagine someone else in this situation? And again, I think that if you think of these other creatures as being basically like non-human animals, you can at least make it plausible to yourself what he's saying. That you owe them humanity, but that they can't enter into property relations, and so you can't respect their property. It doesn't make sense, something like that. Okay, sorry, so getting back to section 5, why does social utility please? So having shown in sections 2 through 4, we skipped section 4, which is about political allegiance and various other random virtues. But having shown in sections 2 through 4 that the main part of virtues are things that are praiseworthy because of their social utility, having shown that just because that's what we praise them for, because that's how you can tell what we praise and what we won't, etc. Now he's asking the question, well, okay, why? Why do we praise those things? Why are we pleased when we're told about someone who's socially useful, even though, again, the society that they're useful for is not our society, but some other society that could even be our enemies? Why does social utility please us? Now, I mean, the first thing you might ask is, well, why is that a problem? I mean, I thought the question of the book was just to determine empirically what it is that we praise and blame, and haven't you answered that? And why am I? Hold on a second. Oh, I did switch to it. Oh, okay. Having found an answer to that, why are you still asking? Why do you need to ask why? So basically, Hume's first answer is that, yeah, it's not really a problem. This is right. This is on page 39 in section 5. Sorry. It is no just reason for rejecting any principle confirmed by experience that we cannot give a satisfactory account of its origin, nor are able to resolve it into other more general principles. Right? So what he's saying is, look, it's just clear empirically that we praise things that are socially useful and blame things that are socially pernicious. So if that's all we can say, we've noticed this regularity, then that's all we can say. That doesn't mean that we haven't found the answer to our question. And he comes back to this again in section 9, actually, and says, like, even if my explanation for all of these principles that I'm giving is rejected, the principles themselves are still empirically correct. So why talk about this then if it's not really a problem from Hume's point of view? Well, I think it's the reason he does is that it seems like a problem. And it seems like a problem, I think, because we have another principle in the back of our mind, namely that we really only approve of, praise, are pleased by what's useful or immediately agreeable to ourselves. Right? That's the principle we have in the back of our mind that seems like it might be right. And of course, if that principle is right, then it would be very hard to answer this question. Right? If what I really praise, approve of, take pleasure in contemplating, however exactly you describe this, is only what's beneficial to me, then how can you explain why I read about some person in ancient Greece and how virtuous they were? Why do I want to praise them? They're not beneficial to me. Um, so, I mean, now, again, I guess maybe I should write these two principles down. They're like rivals. Principle one is social utility. Principle two is utility to me. Right? And the reason I think we're asking about this one is because we still think maybe this one is right. And so we're wondering how you could defend this one. Now, I mean, nevertheless, Hume could just reply, well, look, I have all this empirical evidence for this principle. So just obviously this one is false. Sorry. Right? I mean, you might have hypothesized that the only reason people approve of things is because it's beneficial to them, but I've just shown empirically that it's wrong. Um, so I think he could do that, but he actually wants to do something much more complicated. Um, I mean, uh, well, and without speculating, at least to begin with, why he wants to do something more complicated. So maybe I should have called these A and B because maybe I'll call these A, B, and C. All right. So, um, so the first thing he wants to do is um, show what makes this selfish principle too plausible but false, right? Like what general facts about human nature, um, if we pay attention to them, will um, will let us understand why it might seem like this is true, but it really isn't. Um, and that's basically section 5. Right? Section 5 is an extended discussion of um, uh, like based on general things we know about human nature, what kind of things please us, why you might think it was only these, but it actually includes these. Um, the second thing he wants to do is to explain what makes virtue motivate. right? And this is basically section 9, part 1. He wants to explain because by the time you get to the end of this explanation, part 5, it turns out that he can explain why we have this special kind of praise and approval we give to things that are socially useful. Um, he can explain what principle in human nature it's based on, but it turns out that principle doesn't look very strong. So, in other words, it looks like by the end of this, what we should predict is that we're going to praise this stuff, but we're not actually going to have a strong incentive to do any of it, to be that way. Um, so, in section 9, part 1, he wants to explain why. Now, of course, people are not perfectly benevolent, just, etc., far from it. But it does seem like benevolence and justice and other virtues, at least sometimes people are motivated by the desire to be virtuous, or are motivated to act by the desire to act virtuously, um, uh, more often than you might think, given the kind of weak basis he has uh, um, identified for it in section 5. So section 9, part 1 is supposed to explain using further facts of human nature why, starting with that weak basis, these things can get amplified in a certain way so that they actually come to motivate more strongly than they originally would have, so to speak. And then the last thing he wants to do is the thing he said before it wasn't his business to do, namely to recommend virtue. Recommend virtue means like to tell us, the readers, why we should want to be virtuous. This is section 9, part 2. And you might wonder, if you've done this, why do you need this? Right? He's explained already what does motivate it to us. So why does he have to recommend it to us? Well, as he more or less explicitly explains, it's because by the time you get to this the end of this explanation of what it is that motivates us, it starts to look like, yeah, we're motivated to, but irrationally. Right? Once you understand what motivates people to be virtuous, at least normally, what motivates them to be virtuous, it seems like you could then turn around or you should. In what sense of should? Well, so I mean, basically, when he discusses this part, he goes back to self-interest. Right? In other words, it seems like when you get to the end of this, you say, oh, now I understand why I wanted to be virtuous, but I also understand why it actually, would be bad for me and I shouldn't want it. It's irrational, right? So now, what does this mean? I mean, it means that to recommend something to someone, at least in good conscience, in that case, you must appeal to their self-interest. You can't appeal to other things that happen to motivate them for other reasons. You have to explain why it's really would be in their self-interest to act that way. And that's what he tries to do in section 9, part 2. Now, these 3 points together are if you think back, basically where um, at least I guess, well, okay, sorry, I'm getting caught in my own complicated sentence, but these 3 points together, and especially the third one, is where Locke is going to bring in divine reward and punishment. And the reason I say especially the third one is because, like, to some extent, in the answers to this one and even the answer to this one, Locke, I think, agrees with Hume about what usually makes us praise virtue and what usually motivates us to be virtuous. But he thinks that's not really sufficient. Um, and but there is a real sufficient motivation to be virtuous, namely if you focus on the fact that God is going to reward and punish virtue and vice. That is, that God approves of social utility and has infinite power and knowledge to enforce his will, right? So, uh, so when it comes down to it, there is a rational reason to be virtuous, and the rational reason to be virtuous is what should have motivated us all along, namely divine reward and punishment. And that's also what Locke is going to tell you if you ask him to recommend virtue. Again, he's going to appeal to your self-interest, because again, I think he agrees with Hume that to give someone advice in good conscience, you have to appeal to their self-interest. And so he's going to say, I mean, in Locke's case, I guess, because otherwise you couldn't even listen to the advice. In Hume's case, maybe it's a little more complicated, but basically, yeah, you have to give someone a reason to do something. You have to explain how it's going to help them get pleasure or avoid pain, right? So in the end, when you ask Locke, why should I do things that are socially useful? The answer is going to be, well, it might look like it's against your interest, but God wants you to do things that are socially useful, and he's going to balance that out, more than balance that out with reward and punishment later on in the afterlife, right? After the resurrection, something like that. So that's Locke's answer. It's also kind of, I mean, the question is a little bit different in Kant, but it's also kind of Kant's answer. Kant is actually, in some ways, very close to Locke on this. As far as Hume goes, he doesn't think that that's a good answer to either of these. That is, he doesn't think that the reason we praise things that are socially useful is because we're thinking God will reward them. And he certainly doesn't think we're motivated, in fact, for the most part, to be virtuous because we think God will reward us. As I said, Locke, I think, actually agrees with Hume about that. He thinks most of the time people have the wrong motivation, even when they're virtuous. But in any case, when it comes to this, which is where Locke is especially going to appeal to it, Hume doesn't even mention it as a possibility. Right? So, I mean, in other words, without him having come out and said so, he's. This is where you can see why someone would say he's an atheist. Right? He didn't even consider that maybe the reason you should be virtuous is because God will reward it. He doesn't think that that's a, reasonable answer to the question, even reasonable enough to refute. Okay. So that's the setup of what he's going to do. Now I'm going to discuss some of the details, but I guess first I should ask if there's questions before I go on. Okay. No, I can't. I can just have to erase this. All right. Um, right, so back to section 5, which tries to answer the question, why does social utility please? So, I mean, we have shown empirically that social utility does please. Um, and so there had better be an explanation, but Hume wants to give the right explanation, or like as I said, he wants to show the features of human nature that both make it seem like it wouldn't be correct, and yet, like really, when you think about them more carefully, explain why it is correct. So, but before he gives his explanation, he considers two other explanations that he thinks are wrong. Right? So, I mean, this is a kind of confusing type of. Why is it confusing? I was going to say it's a kind of confusing type of argument that philosophers like and other people usually don't. Maybe it's just confusing because people don't usually make it. But I think it's, I mean, usually when you're in an argument with someone, you try to convince them that you're right. So you bring all the arguments that you think work, or at least that you can get away with, right? Because a lot of times we just want to win the argument. All the arguments that you think you can get away with, you can get past the other person that proved your point of view. So you would not make an argument that looks like it proves your point of view, that you're right, and then show why it doesn't. But philosophers do that all the time, and part of that is because I don't know how far to go in explaining that, but at least part of it is because uh, you're less interested in actually convincing someone that you're right than you are in working out for yourself why you think you're right. Um, I mean, now, like obviously the explanation doesn't end there because then why write and publish it, right? So it's not only you, but you want the person you're talking to not only or not even maybe principally to submit to you and say, okay, you're right. You want there's something you want them to understand about this. And if they admit that you're right, but they don't understand it, then that's no good, right? So anyway, um, whether that reason applies to Hume or not, I'm not sure. But anyway, so these are the two false explanations he considers. The first one is education. Um, so the explanation then would be this is again on page 39. That these the theory is that these moral distinctions were at first invented and afterwards encouraged by the art of politicians in order to render men tractable and subdue their natural ferocity and selfishness, which incapacitated them for society. Right? So the explanation that's being considered is that sure enough, to begin with, like in a natural state, um, we social utility didn't please anyone who didn't approve of it. Again, meaning mere social utility. That is social utility, forgetting about whether the society it's useful to is my society and whether I'm one of the members of my society who will benefit from it. but just like forgetting all of that and just saying that it's social utility. He said, like, the hypothesis is that in natural state that had no attraction at all, but that some clever people noticed that if only they could convince people that this was social utility was praiseworthy, um, they could get them to start um, um, acting more in the interests of social utility, even against their own interests. And in that way, human society would become possible. Um, so that's one explanation. In other words, saying that this is a completely artificial virtue. Um, or, well, sorry, this is a completely artificial basis for praise and blame. In a state of nature, why would you praise or blame someone? You would praise them because they were good for you and blame them because they were bad for you, is the, is the hypothesis. And the other wrong explanation he considers, this is on the next page, on page 40. Um, It has often been asserted that as every man has a strong connection with society and perceives the impossibility of his solitary subsistence, he becomes on that account favorable to all those habits or principles which promote order in society and ensure to him the quiet possession of so inestimable a blessing. Right? So this explanation says that it's not artificial, but it's not actually a different principle from self-interest. Rather, it's like a corollary of the fact that people act in their self-interest. Because everyone wants what's best for themselves, but it's not best for anyone to be without society. Now, I mean, of course, this is questionable depending on how the society is treating you. Maybe, certainly, sometimes it can get bad enough that you would be better off without it. But, maybe that's not a problem for this explanation because they don't have to, you know, they don't have to explain why everyone always praises social utility in every context. They just have to explain why, on the whole, we consider social utility praiseworthy, right? So that is most people in most situations, or something like that. Or maybe in a less charitable light, like them and their friends who have the leisure to study political philosophy in England in the 18th century, and people like them, they certainly are better off because of society. Well, at least you might think, right? I mean, perhaps society actually makes them miserable, as Thoreau or Freud or someone would say. But never mind that. Um, they think that they benefit from society. So maybe that's all they think they have to explain. But Hume says, well, look, I've already given the facts that tell against this, namely that we consider social utility praiseworthy even when it's not in our society, even when it's in our enemies. Um, uh, and there's no possible connection with our self-interest in that case. And he considers, in the next page, he briefly considers like a kind of subversion of this, which says that, yeah, it's true, it's not my real self-interest, but it's my imaginary self-interest, because I imagine myself being in the position of that person's associate and gaining utility from them, even if they're actually lived 2,000 years ago, or if they're actually my enemy right now. Like in imagination, I transport myself, whatever. So Hume says, um, uh, there's no way this kind of fiction could ever um, be strong enough to like maintain itself in the light of the actual knowledge that this person is not good for me. Right? Like I can imagine in a fiction that if I were someone else, they would be good for me. But Hume says, like, um, um, I can't hold that in mind at the same time as remembering they're really not good for me at all. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what he says. So, anyway, um, uh, so I see. I already offered the argument against B. I didn't call them A and B now. Will it be confusing if I use A and B again? Maybe I should use alpha and beta. Education, derived self-interest, and the last one is humanity. Right, so derived self-interest, again, was the one that says this really is just self-interest. It's like a calculation I make from this in my self-interest that people be virtuous. And Hume has offered his arguments against that. The second one, the first one, I didn't say what his argument against it was, but the first one was that this is just all artificial. Politicians, by politicians, of course, we don't mean someone who's running for office. We mean someone who's like trying to design and set up political society in the first place. Society on a larger scale than a family or something like that is what they're trying to achieve for the first time, we're imagining. And that's when they invent these virtues. So, I mean, Hume's argument against this is a little hard to follow. I'm not going to get into it too much, or maybe I'm not going to get into it at all because I want to leave time for the other stuff. But basically, what he says is that although once we have this idea of things that are in themselves praiseworthy or blameworthy, and it doesn't matter how the person is related to me, then it's true education can modify our view about what that is, can like pervert it basically, right? So it can make us think that some things that aren't socially useful at all, like the monkish virtues of celibacy and fasting and silence and so forth, can make us think that those are praiseworthy. But he says we never could have, by education, gotten the whole idea that there's such a thing as being praiseworthy. Like if the politicians came and said, like, here, like I want to tell you, being socially useful is praiseworthy, we would have said, well, what do you mean? Who is it good for? Right? We wouldn't understand the word praiseworthy without being relativized to a person, meaning it's good for me. So that's his argument, basically. There's something to it, but I don't want to say more about it. So that, right, those things rule out these two, and we're left with humanity, which in this context, sometimes he uses this as a synonym for benevolence. It's still, I don't know. In this context, it means our natural tendency to be pleased at seeing someone else pleased, and to be displeased at seeing someone else in pain. And his like big argument in favor of gamma, this last alternative, is I think his main argument is really the burden of proof is on any other theory. What do I mean by that? This is what he says. This is on page 43. Usefulness is only a tendency to a certain end, and it is a contradiction in terms that anything pleases as a mean to an end, where the end itself no wise affects us. And that's pretty strong. Is it really a contradiction in terms? I don't know. But in any case, what he's saying is this, that, like, um, uh, what we've shown to please us in a certain special way, which can't be confused with the other ways things please us, the thing that makes actions or characters praiseworthy or blameworthy is, or anyway, the main part of it is social utility. So social utility means usefulness to a certain end. What end? Well, the happiness of society, right? Like of human beings generally, basically, or at least whichever ones are around this character or action. So what pleases us are the means to a certain particular end, namely the end of human happiness abstractly considered. And he says, there's just no way we could have a special kind of approval of the means to a certain particular end unless, at least a little bit, we value that end. We're pleased at the achievement of that end. Maybe if you think about this right, it actually would start to look like a contradiction in terms. I mean, but if it is to the extent it is a contradiction in terms, it would have to mean that you'd be really sure that this is the right description of what it is we approve of. Right? Like it might be that the things we approve of all happen to be socially useful and therefore are means to this end. But they also have something else in common, and that's why we really approve of them. And, so that would be completely consistent with not being interested in that end. So, like I said, to say it's a contradiction in terms is a little bit strong, for at least for what he's trying to do with it. But I do think, like, maybe a weaker version of this, and he seems to say something like that, this weaker version later, that it would be strange. It would take a lot of convincing to try to show me that we really, always attach a certain kind of approval to a means to a certain end, but we don't care about that end at all. So, in other words, like, the argument is the answer to this question, why does social utility please? And what we wanted to know was, what is it about human nature that shows why it would, that shows us why it would please? And the answer is, well, the very same empirical process that convinces us was also gathering data for the fact that there's a general pleasure at human happiness that human beings have. Now, if that were all he said, maybe it wouldn't be worth all this trouble. But like I said, I think going on underneath this is he wants to show not only why this is the right explanation, but why at first it doesn't seem like it could be the right explanation. And the reason is because although this evidence that we collect does amount to evidence that human happiness in general pleases us, no matter which human being it is, whether they're related to us or not, even if they're our enemy, etc. That's only all other things being equal. So the examples he shows it from, the examples that make it clear are special examples, well, where all other things really are equal, weird examples, right? So, and also these examples, I'm not sure, I feel like they're not as convincing to us now as they were then. One example is pastoral poetry, So pastoral poetry, I haven't even read any of this ever, so maybe it's better than I think. But anyway, pastoral poetry is this genre of poetry that's about shepherds and shepherdesses frolicking in the fields and how they love each other and stuff like that. um, so Hume is saying everyone's favorite kind of poetry is pastoral poetry. um, and that doesn't seem like it's right anymore. And he even to enforce this more, he says like this one poet tried to transfer the scene of all these frolics and everything from the shepherds to like fishermen, and he said, but it didn't work because the idea of fishing is accompanied with ideas of danger and toil and whatever, and that made it unpleasant. So, I mean, for myself, I think I would rather read the poem about the fishermen who have to toil and so forth than about the shepherds and shepherdesses who have no problems frolicking around in the fields. But that's his example. And the other example, which is kind of famous, I guess, is the example of the gouty toes, which is, he says, like, imagine a person who has no relation to you and you don't know them at all is kind of like lying down on the sidewalk, and they have gout, which means that their feet are really sensitive and painful, and their toes are sticking out into the sidewalk, and you have to decide whether you're gonna walk around their toes on the sidewalk or step on their toes. And Hume says, of course, no one in that situation would step on the gouty toes. And again, I'm like, are you sure? I'm not sure. At least, I'm not sure now. Maybe it was different then. I mean, this reminds me of a point in Walden where Thoreau says that he didn't need a lock on the door of his hut because there was nothing valuable there worth taking. And so no one ever harassed him. And I'm like, if you left a hut a mile from town now with no lock on the door and you were gone all day, every day, or many days, you would come back and find it vandalized, probably. Right? I mean, it's maybe all this shows us that our society is really weird, and perhaps in a bad way. But in any case, it's somehow really weird, and therefore you shouldn't expect good general theories to apply to us. But I don't know. Anyway, that's the type of examples he uses, and obviously the reason he has to use that type of example is that if you use a slightly less contrived example, right, like, you know, if you think that I know anything at all about this person to make me like or dislike them, all of a sudden it's going to be less clear which I would do. Or I guess if you know anything, any reason I have to dislike or resent them, then it's going to be less clear what I'm going to do. That is, I certainly can take pleasure in causing pain to people. And I certainly can be pained at seeing pleasure in people too. Right? I mean, now think that, like, instead of having some reason to hate this gouty toe person, I have a reason to envy them. I don't want to see them get more pleasure or lack of pain. They've had enough already, and I haven't got it. My gout is worse, whatever. So again, now all of a sudden, it's not so obvious what I would do, even, I think, according to Hume. So, I mean, what that means is that this explanation, it does explain why we would approve of social utility, but on the face of it, it provides for only possibly a really weak approval of social utility. which would immediately get overshadowed as soon as there was any question of self-interest involved. Um, so, um, um, So if that's the case, you might wonder. So I mean, so first of all, that explains why this principle is hard to get to. Why it seems like the other principle of self-interest ought to be right, because the truth is the other principle of self-interest is mostly much stronger. That's what Hume is saying. For the most part, for most people, most of the time anyway, show them that something is seriously against their self-interest, and they'll forget about whether it's socially useful or not, and they won't want it. Right, like so for example on page 74 he says that this tendency may be too weak to cause us to even move a finger. I guess, maybe in the gouty toes case you're supposed to imagine that I'm kind of halfway in between and I have to go out of my way to do either one or the other. But yeah, so so what does this even explain then? Right? I mean, why do we have this whole deal about virtue and vice if their whole thing is based on this very weak tendency that sure enough we all have, and it would be absurd to deny it, but it's weak, in extraordinary court cases like the gouty toes or whatever, it comes out on top, but most of the time it wouldn't. So Hume says the answer, I don't know what that arrow means, but I'm drawing an arrow to connect this word to this word because they're somehow connected. The answer fundamentally has to do with language, actually. So, like, he compares it to the fact that we have these words big and small. What does big mean? Does it mean it looks big to me from where I am? So in that case, like I could say, oh, this pen is big. And you could say, oh, that, being far away from me, you could say, oh, that pen is not big. And we wouldn't be disagreeing with each other. But instead, that's not the way the words big and small work, right? I'm supposed to correct for my position before I decide whether to call it big or not, right? So it looks very big, but I know it's right next to my eye. So I think, okay, but what would it look like if I were at a moderate distance from it? And then I'm like, oh, yeah, it would look small. It's smaller than my hand. It's smaller than my head, whatever. If I was standing far away, someone would look at it and say it's small. So therefore, instead of saying it's big, I say it's small. Now, why? Why do that? I mean, because like what it looks like to me is in some sense what's more important or more pressing to me. Right? Like, I mean, I want to know how big it looks to me, so I know whether it hides things in back of it and so forth, I guess. I mean, it's not quite that simple, right? I mean, there's also the question of how big it will look to me later when I move away. There's like past self, future self are also involved here. But I think language, I think this is already clear in Locke. Language is not only a means for communicating with other people, but it's also a means for communicating with myself, right? For like noting down my thoughts in order to be able to refer to them later. So, and so the answer, Hume says, the reason the words big and small don't work that way, but the reason you're supposed to correct is that we're like subtracting off the part that only matters to me now and leaving the part that could be of interest to you also, or to me later. Right? And that's what the correction is. So that therefore, if I use the word big that way, when I tell you the pen is not very big, I'm telling you something that's as useful to you as it is to me. I'm leaving out some stuff that would also be interesting to you, and I'm leaving out some stuff that would also be interesting to me, but those two stuffs are not the same stuff, right? So I'm subtracting them out and leaving only the part that's of interest to both of us, namely, like, how the pen looks abstracted from exactly how far you are away from it, something like that. So Hume says it's the same thing with moral language. How much this character benefits me is the most important thing from my point of view. But you're not really interested in that, right? So, although, of course, in this case, maybe the parallel is not exact. We do maybe have a lot of words that express that too, right? Like, I hate that person, or whatever. But nevertheless, that's if I tell you I hate X, that really doesn't tell you something useful about X directly. It tells you something maybe useful about me, so you can predict what I'm going to do next or something, right? But if I want to tell you something interesting about X, about how much X should please or displease, then even though, from my point of view, most of what causes X to please or displease is X's relationship to me personally, I know that part's not of interest to you. And I know, on the other hand, that it's how much X benefits you personally that's mostly of interest to you, but that part's not of interest to me. So I subtract all of that off, and when I'm making the word, now, I mean, Chris, he doesn't really think this happens by a careful plan. This kind of evolves somehow. But anyway, when we're coming up with the word, what we invent a word for is for the thing that could be equally interesting to both of us, because that's what we're going to communicate about. And this is what you have to add in. Communicating with each other is really useful to us personally, right? I would like to be able to tell you things that I know will interest you, and vice versa. So it's in my interest to, it does come back to self-interest, ultimately, but it's in my interest to emphasize these things that can be picked out by words we can use to talk to each other usefully. And it's in your interest too, and therefore we've invented this language, and we use it a lot, and we use it more to express approval or disapproval than the more egocentric language, which expresses things that are actually perhaps more important to us. Because we're trying to keep the actual praises and blames to things that we can expect to be of interest to other people we're talking to. So this, do I have time to talk about this? I'm going to talk about it, perhaps foolishly. I'm going to open a book that I haven't seen for a while, namely Locke's essay concerning human understanding. Okay. I wrote down it's 3.2.7. That doesn't seem right to me, but if it's not there, I'll skip it. I'll just read it from my notes. It's not. I must have written down the citation wrong. Okay, I'll read it from my notes. I have the quote written out. This is Locke. For God having, by an inseparable connection, joined virtue and public happiness together. It's probably 1.2.7. Oh well, anyway. And made the practice thereof necessary to the preservation of society, and visibly beneficial to all with whom the virtuous man has to do, it is no wonder that everyone should not only allow, but recommend and magnify those rules to others, from whose observance of them he is sure to reap advantage to himself. He may, out of interest as well as conviction, cry up that for sacred which, if once trampled on and profaned, he himself cannot be safe nor secure. This, though it takes nothing from the moral and eternal obligation which these rules evidently have, yet it shows that the outward acknowledgment men pay to them in their words proves not that they are innate principles. Nay, it proves not so much as that men assent to them inwardly in their minds, as the inviolable rules of their own practice, since we find that self-interest and the conveniences of this life make many men own an outward profession and approbation of them, whose actions sufficiently prove that they very little consider the lawgiver that prescribed these rules, nor the hell that he has ordained for the punishment of those that transgress them. Right? So that's Locke. And what is Locke saying? As I said before, Locke is saying that even though what really matters to me is my own self-interests, and that's going to determine what I do. If you ask what I'm going to say, then you have to ask, what do I think it's useful for me to praise and blame? So he's actually, I don't know. So how does this answer fit together with Hume's? It's not exactly the same. Right? He's not saying it's useful, just he's saying something more. It's not just that it's useful because other people will listen to me, because they'll understand what I'm talking about or they'll care about it. He's saying it's useful for me because if I can get everyone else to think that these virtues are really great, that will be good for me. And if you ask, so why do you praise people in ancient Rome and whatever? It's because I don't care about the people in ancient Rome, but I want everyone else to use them as models. Because if they use these virtuous people in ancient Rome as models, they're going to treat me better. And then meanwhile, hopefully I can get away with doing whatever I want. That's what Locke is saying. And so it's a little bit different from Hume's answer, but it has this in common with it, that it leaves a question over at the end of part 5. As I was saying, the question being, okay, why do we not only praise these virtues, but actually sometimes try to be virtuous, even when it's apparently against our own self-interest? And again, Hume's not by any means claiming that we always do that, or that, that's ridiculous. But he's, claiming, I think, plausibly that it's an empirical fact that we sometimes do that, right? That calling things virtuous actually does motivate people to want to be that way and so forth. And if this were the reason, if we were all doing this, like all thinking in the back of our minds, of course, I'm really going to do what's best for me, then we would all agree to praise virtue, but none of us would try to be virtuous at all. As I said, I'm going to go on to section 9 now. There's only 10 minutes left, but if there is a question, I will take a question. Okay. So I'm going to go through section 9, part 1 pretty quickly, even though there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. But this, again, remember, is where I say what he's asking, the question he's asking is, what motivates us? Maybe I should say, what motivates people to be virtuous? Right? What gives this thing that we picked out based on some weak tendency that we all share, and then made special words for because it's something we all share, even though it's kind of weak? What makes it sometimes strong enough to bring out these very virtuous actions and characters? And, so like I said, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but there's basically two answers. The first answer is mob mentality, I'm going to call it. He doesn't call it something quite that nasty sounding, but almost, right? He says part of it is, it's the same principle as the principle of like faction or party feeling. If a whole bunch of people see that the other people all approve of something, that makes them want to approve of it more. And then that's like a feedback effect, right? Because everyone now sees, so like at stage 1, everyone sees that all the other people in their party or whatever approve of something weakly, and so they want to approve of it a little bit more strongly, but then they all do that, and so then they all look around and they're like, oh, now I want to approve it even more strongly, right? So as I said, it tends to amplify things that a group of people are agreed in. And Hume says, so here we have something that everyone agrees on. Although initially only weakly, everyone agrees that, yeah, all other things being equal, it's nice that people are happy and bad that they're miserable. So we look around and we say, oh, wow, everyone thinks this. I guess it's a good thing to think. And we start to think it more strongly, right? And so as Hume puts it, all humankind forms the party of vice against virtue. We're like a mob, all drawn to virtue because we're trying to be like everyone else. That's one explanation. And the other explanation is vanity, love of fame. We want other people to praise us. These are the terms of praise that are available. So to begin with, we start trying to at least look like they should praise us. But after a while, we get in such a habit of checking ourselves to see if we're doing something that other people are going to praise, because we have so much vanity that we start like trying to do it for ourselves as a kind of internal audience. This is similar to a famous, maybe the same or maybe not as the same as a famous doctrine of Adam Smith's about the internal spectator as the basis of morality. Okay, so these are the two answers. And again, I said what they have in common is that they're not rational, right? That like if someone once calls your attention to the fact, if it is a fact, that this is why you're motivated to be virtuous, you're going to look at this one and say, hey, just because everyone else approves of this, do I approve of it? A little bit, right? And then like the spell will be lifted, so to speak. Or at least with enough education, it could be. And remember, Hume thinks education can change these tendencies. So like, this is education here, right? I told you to read this book written by Hume. This is education. Hume is involved in educating you about this. And about this too, right? Because here, what I really wanted to do was look praiseworthy to everyone else. But if I'm not going to get caught, it's irrational. I mean, perhaps this desire of vanity already was overblown, right? Like if I think about how much benefit I get from being praised, maybe I'll think, yeah, that wasn't worth it. Anyway, but certainly if it's a case where no one's going to know about it, then it's irrational for me to try to be virtuous out of vanity in that case. So this is what gets him to the last part. Now, as usual, I have, 4 minutes to talk about it. And then, Margaret, there's only 4 minutes left. All right, right, this is the part where he says, well, what can I do to recommend virtue? Now,
Wait, am I supposed to be here?
Not yet, but I'm just telling you, there's only 4 minutes left, so, yeah. So, what's good? So the issue is here, like, I mean, I'll write down where this is. There isn't time to find it in the book. I'll just tell you what he says. He starts off section 9, part 2, by saying that even if something is true, no one's going to approve of it if it's pernicious to society. Now, I mean, basically that's what he just proved, right? If I, through my investigations, discover some truth such that it's not socially useful, and educating people into this truth will make them less useful for society, then people aren't going to like it. They're going to say it's vicious. They're going to blame it. And Hume says, and therefore, even if they can't find a way to refute your argument, they will make sure that your book is buried in oblivion, which is basically what he thought happened to the treatise. Right? So he says, therefore, I better show that my book is socially useful. Now, notice, right, he's saying, therefore, it's in my self-interest to make you think that my book is socially useful. He's not exactly saying that it's in his interest to make it actually socially useful, let alone that that's his motivation, right? But anyway, he's saying, I better be able to explain how it's socially useful. And he's saying that, I think, because the outcome of part 1 made it sound like it's not, like it's pernicious. So people looking at it are going to say, you're assigning young people to read this book? Maybe it should be banned, right? So, it's like, unfortunately, I don't have time to get into the details of what he says here. But in order to answer this, he suddenly switches and asks a really strange question. He says, well, like, if you could decide what you wanted, like, are you going to want money? Are you going to want food? Are you going to want, et cetera, or are you going to want praiseworthiness for being truly virtuous, not just seeming to be virtuous? Hume says, if you think about it, you'll realize that, everyone will have a pleasant life insofar as they get what they want. So all these people have that in common, right? Like the money person will be happy if they can get money. The food person will be happy if they can get food. The virtue person will be happy if they can get virtue. They all have that in common. But then he says, but moreover, the virtue person will have a better life otherwise, because it's more pleasant to try to be virtuous than to try to get money or whatever. That's the argument. There's obviously a lot of weird things about it, which I don't have time to talk about. So on that note.
Q&A
The,
time.
so first of all, the course is over now. I want to emphasize you do not have to stay, but if you have some questions that you want to ask Margaret
About
about anything, I'm gonna now. Do you want the board, Margaret, or do you want?
I don't know. I'm not really tall enough for this, if you notice. But it's also about you. They also have made us.
Okay, if you have questions for either of us.
Who has a question? Anybody?
Thanks for a great quarter. Maybe there are no questions.
Are there any questions about?
You have to put your head in the.
There are no questions. Unless somebody has.
Some people are waiting to see if someone else has a question, I think. Like no one has left, but oh. How has it been having a physics and philosophy degree? Well, that's a question for me, obviously. I don't think you have a physics and philosophy degree, Margaret. Well, the reason I have a physics and philosophy degree is that I tried to get a PhD in astrophysics, but it really didn't work out. And then I switched to philosophy. So I'm not sure if I can give a good answer to that, except, I mean, I'm glad I have that background. It's definitely useful for thinking about a lot of things in philosophy. I'm not sure if that was the best use of my time to get that. I mean, I got a master's, but like to try to get a PhD and not get it for 4 years was perhaps not the best use of my time. But that's a good question. Any other questions?
Does anybody want to know what the back of his computer looks like? You'd be really surprised, I think.
Anyone want to know what the back of my computer looks like? Margaret will show you.
I'm just going to show you anyways because you're probably like, oh, it's just like...
Just, no, carry this camera over behind the computer.
One of those creepy philosophers. Actually, tell me when they see it. Can I see it?
Yes. Baby Shark. The back of my computer has a Baby Shark theme. Okay. That was not a question anyone asked. Okay, it doesn't seem like there are a lot of questions here, but thanks for sticking around while Margaret was here.
Wait, is there one?
That was the one I already answered. And yeah, thank you, all of you. It's despite all the craziness of this quarter, I'm glad that you stuck through this course. And as usual, I enjoyed teaching it. And let me know if you have any questions.
Wait, can I just show them one thing?
Margaret's going to show you one thing.
Can we move this?
No, never mind. It's okay. Oh, she wants to show you her horses. And her sister's horses. There they are. Okay, thank you. Have a good summer. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me or can even make a... Oh, they're saying what a great collection it is. We can even make an appointment to meet if you need to do that. Okay, bye.